The crowd froze as the police officer twisted the black man's arms behind his back, the sharp click of handcuffs echoing through the street. His face was tense, his voice cold. "You're under arrest for trespassing." Bystanders whispered, some pulling out their phones to record, sensing something wasn't right. But no one, not even the officer himself, had any idea who this man really was, or that in just 1 minute, the cop would regret every single word he had just said. But let's start from the beginning. It was an unbearably hot afternoon in downtown Atlanta. The sun blazed down on the concrete sidewalks, shimmering waves of heat rising from the asphalt. Pedestrians moved sluggishly, fanning themselves with newspapers or clutching bottles of water in an attempt to stay cool. David Carter walked confidently along the street, his 6'2" frame moving with an air of quiet authority. He was a 38-year-old black man with sharp features, neatly trimmed facial hair, and an athletic build that hinted at years of disciplined fitness. He was dressed in a fitted gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and a pair of sleek designer sneakers. On his wrist, a silver Rolex reflected the harsh afternoon sunlight. His phone was pressed to his ear as he discussed business with one of his partners. "I want the final inspections wrapped up by Friday. No delays. We have tenants moving in next week, and I don't want any excuses," he said firmly. His deep voice carried the weight of a man who was used to making big decisions. As he walked, he scanned the buildings around him. Rows of red brick structures lined both sides of the street, their facades a mix of old charm and modern renovations. Some had once been abandoned, left to decay, but now they stood freshly painted, with brand-new windows and polished steel signs advertising small businesses. This neighborhood wasn't just a place for him. It was his legacy. Years ago, David had invested millions into this area, buying up entire blocks, revitalizing housing, and attracting local businesses. What had once been a neglected part of town was now thriving, and he had played a key role in its transformation. But just as he was about to turn the corner, a sharp voice cut through the humid air. "Hey, you! Stop right there! Hands where I can see them!" David halted mid-step, slowly lowering his phone from his ear. His eyes narrowed as he turned toward the voice. A white police officer, dressed in full uniform, was walking briskly toward him. His posture was aggressive, his right hand resting firmly on his holstered firearm. He was in his early 40s, stocky, with a thick jaw and a buzz cut that made his stern expression look even harsher. David had encountered men like him before. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone measured and calm. The cop's name tag read T. Wilkins. His pale blue eyes scanned David from head to toe with a look of suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Wilkins demanded. David frowned. "Walking. Talking on my phone. Why?" Wilkins' eyes darkened. "You don't live around here. A few residents reported a suspicious individual loitering near these buildings." David's lips curled slightly in amusement. "Suspicious individual?" he repeated. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I own these buildings. This is my property." Wilkins scoffed. "Oh, really?" He crossed his arms, his fingers still resting near his gun. "You expect me to believe that?" David exhaled sharply. He had neither the time nor the patience for this. "Believe what you want. I'm not required to prove anything to you. Now, if you'll excuse me." But before he could take another step, Wilkins suddenly grabbed his wrist, yanking his arm back. "You're under arrest for trespassing." A murmur ran through the pedestrians who had started gathering around the scene. People stopped in their tracks, whispering amongst themselves. A few had even pulled out their phones, recording the incident. David clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew how quickly these situations could escalate. He had seen too many headlines, too many names of black men who had suffered because they reacted the wrong way. Wilkins roughly pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around," Hands behind your back. Now." David let out a slow breath, steadying himself. His heart pounded with a mix of anger and frustration. He had worked too hard, built too much to be treated like this in his own damn neighborhood. His voice was ice cold when he spoke. "Officer, I'm giving you one chance to take your hands off me." Wilkins laughed. "Oh, you think you're in charge here? That's cute." The officer tightened his grip. David's eyes flickered toward the growing crowd. More people were watching now, and the cameras were rolling. The whole world was about to witness exactly what kind of man Officer Wilkins was. And soon, Wilkins himself would learn the truth. David Carter stood still, his breath controlled, his muscles tense. The pressure of Officer Wilkins' grip on his wrist was firm, almost punishing. The officer's fingers dug into his skin, as if daring him to resist. The growing crowd watched in silence, the tension in the air thick. Some whispered among themselves, others had their phones raised, recording every second. "You really don't want to do this, officer," David said, his voice calm but firm. Wilkins smirked. "Oh, I think I do. You see, punks like you think you can just do whatever you want, walk around wherever you please like you own the place." David's jaw clenched. "I do own the place." Wilkins let out a dry laugh. "Oh, that's rich." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only David could hear. "You're just another thug trying to act important. You think a watch and some nice sneakers make you special? Get real." David's fingers curled into fists. He had dealt with racism before, but something about the sheer arrogance in Wilkins' voice ignited a fire in his chest. He could see it clearly now. The officer wasn't just overstepping. He was enjoying this. David knew that one wrong move, one sign of aggression, could turn this situation deadly. So he inhaled deeply and forced himself to stay still. But the universe had other plans. "Officer, stop! What the hell do you think you're doing?" The sudden voice cut through the tension like a blade. A woman with short blonde hair and a no-nonsense expression was sprinting toward them from across the street. She wore business attire, navy blue slacks and a white blouse, and her face was flushed with anger. Wilkins turned, still gripping David's wrist. "Ma'am, step back. I'm handling a trespasser." The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "Trespasser?" she echoed. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" David smirked inwardly. He knew exactly who she was. "Martha," he said smoothly. "Glad you're here." Martha Williams was the property manager for nearly every building in this district. She worked directly for David, overseeing renovations, handling tenant concerns, and ensuring that the businesses renting spaces in his properties were operating smoothly. She turned to Wilkins, fury in her eyes. "This man is David Carter. He's the owner of this entire block. These buildings, the apartments, the businesses, he owns all of them." Silence. Wilkins' face twitched. He blinked once, twice, as if struggling to process what he'd just heard. That's not possible." His grip on David's wrist loosened slightly. David pulled his arm free and straightened his shirt. He could feel the marks from the officer's fingers on his skin. "Possible?" he echoed. "You know what's really not possible? The fact that you thought you could get away with this in front of all these cameras." Wilkins' head jerked up. He finally noticed just how many people were filming. The weight of the situation seemed to hit him all at once. His hand twitched near his belt as if he were considering reaching for his radio, but then he hesitated. Martha wasn't done. "Do you have any idea how much money this man has invested into this neighborhood? He's the reason half of these businesses exist. You should be thanking him, not throwing him in handcuffs." Wilkins' face burned red. I was responding to a call," he stammered. David chuckled. "Right. A call about a suspicious black man walking through his own property. Real police work, huh? A murmur rippled through the crowd. People shook their heads in disgust. A young man with a baseball cap spoke up. "Man, this is some straight-up racist bullshit." "Yeah, this ain't right," another voice chimed in. Wilkins shifted uncomfortably, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. "Look," he said, taking a step back, "maybe there was a misunderstanding here." David folded his arms. "You mean like the misunderstanding where you accused me of trespassing on my own land? Or the part where you tried to throw me in the back of a squad car because you didn't believe a black man could own something like this?" Wilkins' lips pressed into a thin line. Sweat was forming on his forehead. He was trapped, and he knew it. "All right, listen." But David wasn't finished. "No, you listen. Because in about 5 minutes, that video is going to be all over the internet, and by tonight your name is going to be in the headlines. So I'd start thinking real carefully about my next move if I were you." Wilkins swallowed hard. He was rapidly losing control of the situation, and the way the crowd was staring at him with disdain made his stomach churn. He had walked into this thinking he was in control, thinking he had the power. Now he was beginning to realize that he was the one with everything to lose. The weight of the moment bore down on Officer Wilkins like a ton of bricks. His authority, once absolute in his mind, now felt like a fragile mask that was cracking under the weight of reality. The name David Carter was suddenly seared into his brain, not as just another suspect, but as a man who wielded more influence in this neighborhood than he ever could. The crowd wasn't dispersing. If anything, more people had gathered. Some whispered, others stared at Wilkins with expressions ranging from disgust to outright fury. Phones were still recording from multiple angles, capturing every twitch of his face, every nervous shift of his stance. David Carter, on the other hand, was composed, his arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes locked onto Wilkins with an intensity that made the officer sweat. He wasn't just angry. He was calculating. "You want to tell me something, officer?" David asked, his voice calm, but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. Wilkins licked his lips, his pulse pounding. "Think, Tom. Think." "Look," he started, raising his hands in an attempt to pacify the growing hostility around him. "I may have overreacted. I was responding to a call." David's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, that's cute. Overreacted? That's what we're calling it now?" He took a step closer, and Wilkins instinctively tensed, gripping his belt. The officer still thought he could regain control with intimidation. David saw it, and it only made him angrier. "Let me get this straight," David continued, his voice now rising just enough to command the full attention of the crowd. "You see a black man walking in a nice neighborhood, his own neighborhood, so you assume he doesn't belong. You don't ask questions, you don't check facts, you just go straight to force, straight to cuffs." Wilkins' face flushed a deeper red. "Now, wait just a damn second." "No, you wait a second, officer." David's voice was booming now, powerful, authoritative. "How many times have you done this? How many times have you put your hands on someone who didn't deserve it? How many times did it not get caught on camera?" The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A woman in a summer dress shook her head. "Damn, he's got a point." "Bet he's done this plenty before," a man muttered. Wilkins' eyes darted around the crowd, then back to David. "Look, I made a mistake, all right? I get it. You want to make me the bad guy?" "You made yourself the bad guy." David's voice was quieter now, but every word dripped with controlled fury. "And now you're scared because, for the first time, there are consequences." Wilkins swallowed hard. The shift in power was suffocating. "So what do you want, huh? You want me to beg? You want me to apologize on camera?" he snapped, his frustration bubbling over. "Fine. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't know who you were." David let the words hang in the air for a moment, then shook his head with a dry chuckle. And that's the problem. Wilkins frowned, confused. What? David stepped even closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Wilkins could hear. You think my status changes anything? If I wasn't David Carter, billionaire real estate developer, if I was just another black man in a hoodie walking home, what do you think would have happened? Wilkins had no answer, because they both knew exactly what would have happened. David took a slow step back, exhaling sharply. The rage inside him was still burning, but he wasn't going to let it consume him. He had won. The whole world was seeing this for what it was. The career of Officer Tom Wilkins was already over. The only question now was how much worse it was going to get. Take these cuffs off me, David finally said. Wilkins hesitated for a fraction of a second before fumbling for his key. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the cold metal from David's wrists. As soon as the cuffs clicked open, David rolled his shoulders, rubbing the red marks on his skin. Now, you're going to step back, David continued, his voice firm. You're going to turn around and you're going to walk your ass back to that squad car. And then you're going to sit there and think about how you just ruined your own life in less than 5 minutes. Wilkins' face contorted in anger, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked stiffly toward his patrol car, the weight of 100 recording cameras following his every movement. The crowd erupted into cheers. David Carter had just taken down a man who had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable. The moment Officer Wilkins turned away, the tension in the air snapped like a broken wire. The once silent, watchful crowd erupted into cheers, shouts, and murmurs of disbelief. People clapped, some whistled, and others muttered under their breath about how justice had finally been served, in real time, in broad daylight, for everyone to see. David Carter stood still, rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had dug into his skin. A dull ache lingered, but it was nothing compared to the fire still simmering in his chest. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, shaking off the weight of what had just happened. Wilkins, red-faced and humiliated, stomped back toward his patrol car like a wounded animal. His movements were stiff, jerky. His whole body radiated frustration, but he didn't dare look back. He knew the eyes of the entire neighborhood were burning into his back. And worst of all, he knew his career had just ended. David didn't have to do anything else. The moment those cameras started rolling, the game had changed. The internet would take care of the rest. "You all right, Mr. Carter?" Martha Williams asked, stepping closer. Her expression was still tight with anger, but her voice was softer now, concerned. David flexed his fingers. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just another day in paradise, huh?" She scoffed, crossing her arms. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. Not here. Not anywhere." David let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, well, it's nothing new." Martha shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's disgusting. That officer should be fired. Hell, he should be sued." David smirked. "Oh, don't worry. He'll be handled, one way or another." As if on cue, a man in a crisp navy blue suit emerged from the crowd, his expression unreadable. He walked with the smooth, deliberate confidence of someone who was used to dealing with problems. "Mr. Carter," the man said, extending a hand. "James Holloway, civil rights attorney. I saw everything." David raised an eyebrow but shook the man's hand. "That's so." Holloway nodded, glancing toward the retreating officer. "What just happened here? It's about to be national news, and I can guarantee that Wilkins is going to be desperate to cover his ass. If you're interested, we can talk about legal action. Civil lawsuit, misconduct charges. He needs to be held accountable." David considered it. Suing the officer? Dragging his name through the courts? Making sure his entire record was put under a microscope? It was tempting. Very tempting. But David knew something far worse was already happening. "I appreciate it, Mr. Holloway," he said, "but I think Wilkins has bigger problems coming his way." The lawyer frowned slightly, as if he was about to argue, but before he could, the unmistakable chime of a news notification went off from someone's phone in the crowd. A woman gasped. "Holy shit, it's already trending." The words sent a ripple through the people around her. Phones lit up, fingers scrolled rapidly, and within seconds the murmurs turned into a chorus of reactions. "Oh my God, they're posting his badge number. This is blowing up. Dude, there's already a petition to get him fired." David watched the realization crash over Wilkins' face as he sat inside his squad car. He had just pulled out his phone, checking whatever messages were coming in, and as soon as he saw them, his whole body went rigid. He knew. He knew that he had just become the face of everything wrong with law enforcement. And now, the whole world was watching. The fallout. By the time David got back to his office later that evening, his name was all over the news. Every major outlet had picked up the footage. The headline variations were endless. Cop attempts to arrest wealthy black man for trespassing, instantly regrets it. Officer faces backlash after racially profiling real estate mogul. Caught on camera, the arrest that ended a career. And sure enough, within 24 hours, Wilkins was suspended. Within 48 hours, his entire disciplinary record was leaked to the public, and within a week, he had resigned. But it didn't stop there. As David sat behind his desk, scrolling through updates, Martha walked in, holding a tablet. "You're not going to believe this," she said, setting it down in front of him. David leaned forward, glancing at the screen. It was an official statement from the Atlanta Police Department. Wilkins was being investigated for multiple past complaints of racial profiling. David exhaled sharply.